in chapters 38 and 39 of Job. First of all, God made the point that the world he has made has many more variables and considerations at play than Job and his friends, I will add, but particularly Job, because God's talking to Job. There are many more variables and considerations at play than Job has been accounting for. Now, this point on its own would be pretty heartless and brutal thing to say to someone who's lost his kids and lost everything. And so it's not the only argument that God has, only point he made from his first speech. He also made the point that the world that God has made is orderly and very good, and God runs it as such. Now, Job has made many claims early on in the book, starting in chapter 3 from his first speech, that the world is not orderly and is not very good, and that there is, I've heard one person describe it, that Job described the world as an inner city ghetto where people are crying out constantly and constantly in pain and no one's answering them. Job made that claim, and God says, actually, more than you know, Job, the world's really, really good, and I'm involved in it in really good ways, and so don't forget that. Finally, the world that God has made has some allowable levels of chaos and evil, but this does not imply that God doesn't care about justice or morality. And this is where the leeway, maybe that's the wrong phrase, but this is where the squidginess, the difficulty that Job and his friends are having with understanding God really, really comes. This point led to the unfurling of the other two that they couldn't really comprehend. But these 3 points together make God's first speech, which is enough for Job to realize that he needs to stop talking because there's more going on than he realized. But it seems like as you read Job and you get to Job's response at the beginning of Job chapter 40, all Job does is shut his mouth and say, I won't speak any further. And in that silence, God speaks more. But we're going to see one of the important things to notice is that after God's second speech, that's when Job really repents. He doesn't repent of any sin, by the way, but he repents of how he spoke about God, how he didn't know God, and he repents of that in his confession. And this second speech is what convinces him that that he shouldn't have said what he said about God, that he shouldn't have made the claims he made about God. And it's God's second speech, seemingly, that really convinces Job that he needs to repent like this. And he's fully convicted that he has wrongly accused or wrongly spoken about God and his creation. And that's why I think it's important to see really the messages of both speeches clearly. The first speech is really, really helpful. They're both very helpful, of course. God does not do anything that is useless or unhelpful. But they are similar, but also, I think, make different points. So he starts off this second speech kind of talking about how he can array himself in battle. He can array himself as this divine warrior. Starting in chapter 40 and verse 10, adorning with eminence and dignity, clothing with honor and majesty, pouring out the overflowings of anger. And he's saying, Job, can you do this? Again, he's speaking in these rhetorical questions saying, can you do these things that I'm going to do? Can you be who I am? Can you do what I'm doing? And if you remember from the last chapter, that's how he asked all the questions about the ostrich and the mountain goat and the horse and the hawk and all these things. Is it at your command that the eagle soars, Job? Well, no, of course, only you, God. And the same effect and same answers are going on with these rhetorical questions in chapters 41 and 42, or rather 40 and 41, where God's asking all these rhetorical questions, and the emphasis is, no, only you, Lord. Only you can do this. But it's a little different. The first speech really focuses in on all of God's creation, the points we just mentioned as we summarize the first speech. But this one starts to zero in on God as this divine warrior. Taking care of justice, humbling the proud, humbling the wicked. And this is, only God can do this. Which, there's so many interesting points about this, but one of the interesting things to think about this is that this lines up so well with all the things God says in the New Testament, doesn't it? Do not take your own vengeance, for I will repay. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. There's all these reminders that we need, that Job needed as well, because he was really putting himself in the place of divine judge at some points. He's getting himself, getting a little big for his britches, we might say. He was kind of putting himself in a place that he shouldn't have in some of the ways he spoke, because he wasn't too pleased with God's divine justice. And so when God brings this up, he says, you can't do this. There's no way you could do this. Only I can roll up my sleeves and really be this divine warrior. You can see that here in Job 40. As I have been mentioning, I'm kind of blazing through some of the stuff we went through last week until we get to the questions we're going to be talking about with Leviathan particularly. And I got ahead of myself too. Why is God being described as a divine warrior significant? And how would Job hear it and how do we? And I think it's imperative to see this, that Job had already felt like he had faced the wrath of God to some extent, to a large extent in his life. And to see God show up and talk about himself as a warrior, it's interesting kind of tonally and kind of contextually for Job in his life, because there had been some theories and some ideas that God had been fighting against Job up to this point. I think part of what God's saying is, I haven't been fighting against you. I think that's part of the implication of this too. Again, the verses we just looked at. And then we get into this idea of behemoth, starting in chapter 40, verse 15. This is the second part of God's second speech, where he starts to go in on describing this kind of land animal that eats the crops and has muscles and bones are bronze, limbs are like bars of iron. He's the first of the ways of God. Let his maker bring near his sword, it says in verse 19. Surely the mountains bring him food, and all the beasts of the field play there, in the covert of the reeds and the marsh. All these ideas. Can anyone capture him when he is on watch? With barbs, can anyone pierce his nose? We talked a lot about this idea, whether or not we come to a conclusion, to the totally united conclusion on what specifically God's describing here. What force does the description have? We can all be on the same page about what the point of, like, the significance of how he shares it, right? What is God saying with this description of this behemoth, this beast of beasts, really? This word is used a lot in its plural form throughout the Bible to mean just animals. But here in the singular, it becomes this thing where it's like the beast of beasts, the super beast, this like animal of animals. What impact does God's description here really have on us as we read it, maybe have on Job? I know we covered this some last week, but I thought it'd be good to ask this question again. Go ahead, Roger.
Well, I wasn't here last week, so it'll be
all the better. All the better, probably. You're not burdened by my...
yeah. Sometimes focus on what these animals might be instead of the picture that God is presenting here.
Mm-hmm.
Job knows how difficult these animals are and that they are beyond human strength to handle. Yet God created them. God doesn't need any of that power to do. That's how powerful God is.
Mm-hmm.
Because he can handle that. He can handle Leviathan. He created them. When you look at 38 through 40 and God's going through all of these descriptions, to me it's just so much stuff we take for granted.
Yeah.
And we take for granted the power that God has. And
certainly.
So by him showing this power to Job, it just makes him...
Yeah, that is one of the impacts it has. And I think certainly, whatever the case, we all agree that what God, the large impact of what God's doing is showing that he is bigger than this problem that is in the world, right? Than this unsolvable problem by mankind. God is bigger than it. And I think regardless, there is implication that God's drawing near with his sword in this, right? Verse 19, let the maker draw near with his sword. Just super interesting, right? It seems like for whatever reason, God's going to battle with this creature. Good. Ricky, did you have a comment?
No,
all right.
Said Roger was here, but he mentioned everything that we was talking
he was right on. Good. Any other comments? Any other thoughts about how Behemoth is introduced or the impact that it has on us as we read it? Or the impact it would have had on Job, for that matter, as he heard it then? All right. So, again, I want to point out the way that God talks about these things. I've already said this, and I've already answered it, so I'll talk a little more about it. But this idea of why God asks these series of rhetorical questions. And this particularly, you see it in quick succession in chapter 41, the first 11 verses. And pay attention to how it serves to introduce us Leviathan. Look here in verse 1. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? Or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Or will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him for a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you bind him for your maidens? Will the traders bargain over him? Will they divide him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons? Or lay his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, your expectation is false. Will you be laid low even at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he dares to arouse him. Who then is he that can stand before me? Who is given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So you see this, again, what's the force of the rhetorical questions to Job? Who? Who can do this? Can you do this? Yeah. No, you can't. You can't do this. You can't do this. You can do this. Even all the traders and the merchants together, all the mankind kind of filling his skin with harpoons and fishing spears. Lay your hand on him. Again in verse 8, he mentions a battle with this creature. God seems to, as much as he's like talking in some kind of, I'm not saying he's reverencing this as a greater creature, but in some kind of reverence for the grandeur of this creature, God seems to be speaking like, look at this thing, it's amazing. And as much as he says that, both the creatures he talks about, there is a reference to a battle or the maker drawing near with his sword, which is fascinating, right? As much as God talked about in the first speeches, all these animals, the eagle, the ostrich, the hawk, the lion, all these things that he takes care of, never did he mention, I'm going to kill these animals. But these creatures, for whatever reason, God is talking about, the implication is they must be killed. Like there is like some kind of hunt going on for them, or some battle really is the word used. And I think that's fascinating. And so these rhetorical questions build up this force that God is doing something with these creatures that mankind cannot do. That seems to be the force of the rhetorical questions to me. It builds up, right? Can you birth mountain goats or keep the ostrich's eggs intact, Job? No, you can't. The ostrich barely can. I do. Can you battle with Leviathan and even can you make a dent in this thing? No, Job. I can. And in fact, I will. Just like I will preserve the ostriches, I will take care of Leviathan too. That seems to be, to me, the force of the direction God is moving with these questions, and the implications that God can, that he does, and he will. That's again, I see that in here. That's why I read this. Any other thoughts about these rhetorical questions that introduce Leviathan? And yeah. All right, let's keep pushing on. So again, as you start to look at this, one of the last questions I want to ask before we get into some of the reasons why I consider Leviathan to be this kind of, the words all fail. He's a representation of chaos and evil, I think. But what kind of tone does God seem to have as he describes Leviathan? And what relationship does he draw between Leviathan and people? Did you see it? I mean, look, if you have your Bibles open, look at chapter 41. There's a whole bunch more verses from, we read the verse 11 verses, but 12 through 34, he goes on and on to speak more. I mean, he talks about, verse 12, he says, I will not keep silence concerning his limbs or his mighty strength or his orderly frame. He goes on to talk about how he sparks fire and out of his nostrils smoke goes forth. What kind of tone does this seem to have? It's maybe a tricky game always to kind of parse out tone in written text, right? He seems kind of proud of it, doesn't he? I mean, he's looking and says, look how awesome this thing is. It's like the first 11 verses would have been enough, and verse 12 he says, I can't stop talking about this creature. And it's interesting, again, when someone else I read talked about this, that if this creature is so terrifying, and if it is the source of kind of all of the problems that are going on, or if it's this kind of this force that only brings destruction and terror to mankind, and God's like, this thing is pretty cool, huh? Look how powerful and strong and how much I've done in creating it. It starts to imply this kind of total lack of concern on God's hand, not for mankind, but lack of concern that this thing is nothing to me. Look at it, it's kind of cool, it's kind of cute to God almost. It's like, look, it's just so powerful, I made this. It's beneath me. And as he shows this relation between Leviathan and man, it's not that. When we look at Leviathan, it's like, well, I'm glad you feel that way, God, because to me, to the reader, to Job, and to, I think, the people who would have read this, Leviathan was a horror of cosmic scale, really. Ricky?
So with that being said, every challenge, every problem, everything, that's what God, I think he's trying to lay out.
Yeah.
With Job, with his, again, Leviathan, behemoth.
Yeah.
I made it. It's cool to me.
Yeah.
You can do nothing about it.
Yeah.
And so when we read it and we go through and we see it and maybe we come in contact with this behemoth thing. And God is going,
I got it.
I got this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is courage.
Yeah, and I think what it inspires or connects to in the ideas of the New Testament is that it's like Nick's lesson a couple weeks ago when I was sick, that this idea that when we engage with the suffering, the trials of our lives, we come at them and say, there's no good reason for this. Why on earth would God let me go through this? Why am I facing this? Why won't it end? Why is it going on this long? We have all these whys, and those can be kind of blasphemous, like Job's questions, but as God says, he's like, this world has allowable levels of chaos and challenge and pain and evil, as we might call it. And God says, I have a purpose for it. I'm still in charge of it. And again, there's fine lines here, right? We can get real close into saying what James makes the exact opposite point. God doesn't create evil. He doesn't inspire it or, he doesn't hope for it. But in God's world, as he's still in control of it, he has a use for it in our lives. And and again, I'm not just like freewheeling here. What happened in the first 2 chapters of the book of Job? Who came to God? Satan came to God, right? And he said, hey, I want to do something with Job. And did God say, no evil can happen? God allowed it. And so we have to believe, and we have to see, which is very challenging, and this is what I think the entire point of the book of Job is trying to get us to really wrestle with, is that God has a purpose for allowing for in his world some levels of chaos and evil that maybe go beyond what we would want or what we would allow if we thought we were God, right? And that's kind of how the description of Leviathan really paints this picture. Look at this horrible beast. I'm not going to stop talking about it. I'm bigger than it. I've created it, and it has its purposes. But one day, I'm going to go to battle with it. One day, I will draw near with my sword to Behemoth. And the implication is, and that'll be that. One day, it'll be all over. Does that sound like any other book of the Bible, by the way? Maybe the last book in the Bible where the saints are under the throne crying out, how long, O Lord? And God allows it to go on for 1,000 years, whatever that means, as we start to interpret that. But the implication is that it goes on longer than people want it to. And God's going to end it all eventually in his time. But he has a purpose for us in the meantime to go through the challenges and the trials we have ahead of us. I think that's why Job gets the same answer the saints in Revelation get to some extent, where the pain and the challenge and the loss. How much did the Christians of the first few centuries lose? How many people did they see die in merciless, brutal ways? Family members, just like Job. And they got a similar answer to Job, I believe. God doesn't say, hey, it's all okay. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is there is a purpose, but don't worry, the battle is secure. I've won the battle already. I'm going to make it right one day. Go ahead, Roger.
Revelation's message is endure until the end.
Mm-hmm.
God's got a plan. Things are going on. If you really where you're going to get the prize. He chose Job.
Yeah.
He picked him out of all of mankind and said, look at him.
Mm-hmm.
And then allowed all this to happen. Job has no idea why. He has no idea what's going on. But when he brings up Leviathan and Behemoth, mankind fears that more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
They have no way of controlling it. They have no defense against it. It's portrayed in these chapters as being just out of our complete control.
Yeah.
Yet, he doesn't fill the world with those animals.
Mm-hmm.
You might run across one, but for the most part, mankind is in charge of all the animals. That's the description of, can you domesticate them? Can you sell them to travelers or, not travelers.
Traders.
Traders, thank you. So all of these things are going on. And imagine if Job could have approached his trials understanding the true power of God.
Mm-hmm.
I said earlier, we tend to take it for granted. I imagine Job did as well.
Yeah.
And there he is, seeing things that are happening, and it was at the end of the world. It felt like it to him, but then God turns that completely around.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really is a way of saying, and if I can handle this guy, don't you think you could have a little more faith?
Yeah. I think that is the thrust of this, right? So here is my reasoning, all right? Just as clear as you'll get, as I lined it up best I could. First of all, there's an interesting thing in this. No matter how you understand these creatures, they are described figuratively. And so we all have to kind of put things together with the poetic language, right? That's why any conclusion is kind of tough. If it's a crocodile, it's a fire-breathing crocodile. And if it's a hippo with a big tail that's like a cedar tree. And if it's dinosaurs, then fine enough. I guess maybe the dinosaurs did breathe fire, but it still seems kind of like, I don't know, like it, no matter what, it is hyperbole. And so we have to wrestle with this poetic, figurative language. And it's interesting how, when God spoke about the ostrich, there was some kind of poeticism to it, but ostriches literally lay their eggs in the sand. And all the creatures God talked about, the mountain goats literally birth up in the mountains, and the hawks fly. Like all the creatures in chapter 30 and 39 are pretty literally described with their names. Yet these two creatures aren't. And so there's something here where it's interesting, right? The difference as God speaks in these two speeches. One is very literal, even in its poetic language, and one is very, very figurative, which leads to the discussion we're having, right? Secondly, and maybe this is one of the most important things to note, God's second speech changes Job's mind. If God was continuing on kind of Job's silence, so God says, all right, I see you don't have anything to say. Let me keep going and tell you about more animals that I've created. More animals that if those first 8 didn't do it, let's list another 2 for you. I have some questions about how this changes Job's mind. Just forcefully, argumentatively as the book goes on, it kind of doesn't feel like it concludes anything for me as I read it. Again, this is a very subjective argument, I understand, but I'm just saying this is why I think this. His first speech led Job to realize, I need to listen up. But his second speech shows Job, I've been wrong this whole time. And so that's why I tend to see that there's something big going on with these creatures. Behemoth and Leviathan are these representations for something that God is going to battle with and conquer for Job and all of mankind. Another argument, another reason is that it fits in with the other mentions of Leviathan. I mentioned this last week. In Job 3, I'll just put it up there. Job 3, when Job's first speech after everything horrible happens to him, he says, let those curse the day, let those curse it who curse the day, who are prepared to rouse Leviathan. Let the stars of its twilight be darkened, let it wait for light but have none, and let it not see the breaking dawn. In all of this, Job's kind of saying, I wish that the world had just ended the day I was born. And this idea of Leviathan being roused in the middle of it speaks to this kind of like Leviathan is this cataclysmic creature that brings about the end of the world. And you can see in God's speech about Leviathan, he says, you don't want to rouse Leviathan. He's actually speaking, I think, directly to Job's speech. He's like, you asked for that. You don't want that. You can't do anything about that. That will not go well for you. If I did that, it would be okay. And so we see, I think here we even see this. There's kind of this idea of rousing Leviathan seems, I don't know, there's just a lot here that seems kind of big, just big. And then Isaiah chapter 26, really in chapter 27, verse 1, he says, come, my people, enter into your rooms and close your doors behind you. Hide for a little while until indignation runs its course. For behold, the Lord is about to come out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity, and the earth will reveal her bloodshed and will no longer cover her slain. Chapter 27, verse 1, Isaiah 27, 1, in that day the Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, with his fierce and great and mighty sword. Even Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will kill the dragon who lives in the sea. Now, you can see here, and maybe you'd say, Ben, he's talking about these nations that have been sinful. And maybe so. But a lot of times it's interesting how the devil, even in Revelation, right? I mean, the devil and the serpent and the beast represent evil nations that were going to be used by God and then judged by God. Whatever the case, Leviathan here seems to be a symbol of something, a symbol of these evil forces that God's going to punish, destroy with his sword again. And even at the end, Leviathan, the twisted serpent, I mean, to me, that brings up imagery of the devil, the dragon mentioned in Revelation. All these things are conflated, not in a negative way, but they are put in parallel with Leviathan here in Isaiah 27. A couple more verses, and I'll be done with this point. We can have some discussion if you'd like. Psalm 74, verses 12 to 17. Yet God is my king from of old, who works deeds of deliverance in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. Leviathan apparently has multiple heads. Yes. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You broke open springs and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day. Yours also is the night. You've prepared the light and the sun. You've established all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. Awesome. This is a beautiful poem. This is big and grandiose. Again, last one. These are all the mentions of Leviathan in the Old Testament. Psalm 104, starting verse 24. O Lord, how many are your works? In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. There is the sea, great and broad, in which are swarms without number, animals both small and great. There the ships move along, and Leviathan, which you have formed to sport in it, they all wait for you to give them their food in due season. You give to them, they gather it up. You open your hand, they are satisfied with good. You hide your face, they are dismayed. You take away their spirit, they expire and return to their dust. You send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. This one doesn't really give us heads or tails about Leviathan. Either way, no matter how you see Leviathan in Job, this one kind of fits into it. But nonetheless, these are all mentions of Leviathan. And especially Psalm 74 and especially Isaiah 27 paint this picture. I mean, Psalm 74 mentioning the multiple heads of Leviathan being crushed by the Lord. There is something to here in the total picture that the Bible gives us in the Old Testament. Few as those verses are, the total picture is that Leviathan is this completely other creature. And that it is beneath God, but it is powerful. And again, also, it's important to note, you see this in the Gospels with the calming of the sea. The sea and the ocean was a representation for chaos within itself. And a great sea serpent with multiple heads and breathing fire, living in the sea, coming out of the sea, is exponentially more so that way. I think is how this idea follows. Any thoughts about this so far? Again, I know I'm just laying out my arguments so you can see why I think this. If you think these are dinosaurs, I'm okay with that. You know, if you think that they're a crocodile or hippopotamus, I'm okay with that too. I don't think that breaks the book. I don't think that breaks our understanding of God. The reason I care to put these arguments out there is because I think they help us forcefully appreciate the climactic ending of the book as it's written. That's what this understanding gives. And I think it helps the book, helps the book fit together for me. That's why I'm sharing this. All right, a few more and I'll be done. Complements and completes God's first speech. I've kind of already made this point. That God's first speech has some lingering questions for Job, I think. And with this understanding of Behemoth and Leviathan, it really shows that there is something cosmic going on that's way bigger than mankind, and that God is more than ready and equipped to make it right in his time. And I think that even if it's a dinosaur, I don't think that gets to that point quite as well as this kind of giant sea monster with heads and literally unkillable. Again, I made this point too. Job's mind is changed and he repents only after God's second speech. And I've also made this point that it looks forward to God's final defeat of Satan mentioned throughout the pages of the Bible, most directly in Genesis 3:15, where he talks about what he's going to do with Jesus, and then ultimately in Revelation 20 and verse 10, where God casts him into the lake of fire and brimstone. Not only does it make Job fit together, but I think it also makes Job fit together with God's storyline of the whole Bible, what he's doing. Because here's where Job really falls. The question that Job is really getting at, and I think part of the reason God chose Job is because Job was the man who could handle this and prove this point and live this out for us, understand that God has a purpose for the evil and the difficulty and the pain that is so real. It's so real in Job. You can't read the book of Job and not think, wow, that's real pain he faced. And we've all faced, I look in this room, I know some of your stories. There's real pain in this room. I've faced some real pain in my life. We all have. And in those moments, your faith is made or broken a lot of times. But you appreciate that this question that people have isn't just like, oh, I don't like God, I have this philosophical problem. No, it's real. When life gets so dark, it is challenging to make the world fit together logically. How can God be loving like he said? How can I suffer so? In the book of Job, with this answer, it reminds us not to lose faith that God's going to make it right, even though I can't see a possible way for that to be true right now. And that's the response Job has. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I retract and I repent in dust and ashes. I believe that the reason Job has such a strong call to repentance and really, he's like, now I see. He didn't see a God who could answer the problems in his life until God said, I have the sword at the ready to kill the evil that has hurt you so. And I will do it one day. It's not done yet. And in fact, Job, it's not going to be done in your day even. But one day I will. And that's the same answer he gives us today. who have faced real pain and real evil and real chaos and just the destruction that comes in this broken, sinful world. And we look up to God and say, come quickly, what's going on? And he says, one day, it'll all be over, but now I have a purpose for you. Job had a purpose. And to me, this appreciation, this understanding of Leviathan and Behemoth, not that they're myth, or not that they're not real, they are a part of God's creation, but they are representations of the evil that God allows in the world. They're representations of Satan himself, who God created and allows for. And we have a lot of challenge with that. And so this, to me, is why I've come to the conclusion I've come to about these Behemoth and Leviathan. All right, any other thoughts? Any other ideas or questions? Go ahead, Dave.
So like I said, this doesn't pertain to salvation and stuff like
Yeah.
that, but just the topic.
Yeah.
So my questions would be, why does Job, my thing is, I see all the scriptures for Leviathan.
Yeah.
The scriptures on Behemoth, because Job 40:15 says, Behemoth I made
Yeah.
as well as you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like I'm looking for, this ain't no word salad, so what,
Yeah.
What's the Behemoth part of this?
Yeah.
And then we all know, I'm not saying this pertains to dinosaurs.
Yeah.
But we know there's bones in the ground.
Sure.
So they were a real thing.
Yes.
And I'm not saying it pertains to this, but, and then I also, the thing that puts thoughts in my mind, need to know, well, I don't need to know more, because like I say, it doesn't pertain to salvation.
Mm-hmm.
But why would Job understand what Behemoth means and what Leviathan means?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are good questions. So first, there is no other mention of Behemoth in the Bible. There is mention of the plural, just that it just means animals in those times. This is where one of the arguments I didn't mention, because it gets real, I don't know, extra biblical and kind of like, there's a lot of ancient Near Eastern myths about Leviathan for sure. And there are also lots of ancient Near Eastern myths of the time about a creature like Behemoth. Not as many, to be sure. But what this means is it's like talking about George and the Dragon today to some extent. Like, not to the same extent, but it's a picture for something that was well known at the time, would be the argument. And you would get it if it was something that you were well acquainted with. Just like the sea in general represents chaos, and Leviathan is brought up multiple times. And so part of it's like, there's not as much conclusively about Behemoth, but to me it gets lumped in to some extent with this speech where he's making a similar point. And then my mind does go to Revelation where it talks about the beast of the sea and the beast of the land, which again are representations of real things going on in the world, but they are not actual creatures, but they are kind of creatures destined for damnation but causing trouble for God's people. And to me, Behemoth and Leviathan to some extent fit in well with those, but again, those are just connections. And secondly, dinosaurs are real, and dinosaurs and mankind coexisting on the earth, I have no problem with that. I'm being real careful. That's beyond my knowledge, right? So I want to be real careful to not make any claims one way or the other about that. I hope that no one thinks I'm making this argument because I'm trying to say that dinosaurs didn't exist. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm making this argument separate from that. And I'm saying that to your point, like, that may or may not be the case, and you're right. That could fit in well, and that's why I'm trying to be real humble about this. That's a good counterpoint. That's a good thought to think. Like, dinosaurs are real, and the possibility of dinosaurs and people coexisting could fit in here, and there could be some real reality to that. And the third question you brought up, what was it again? Do you remember? Do I remember? Job knew about it. Yeah, and so I think that that's just like Leviathan gets brought up in the Psalms, and we don't know about it. Maybe there was some more about Behemoth. There's certainly some idea about what Leviathan is and what it represents, and we can piece together. They certainly believe. Like, if you bring up the ocean today, we don't think, oh, chaos and fear. Maybe some of you do, but it was a general device used for them to represent that, and Leviathan particularly. And so these are some of the things that, like, when they get brought up by name, it seems like the Jewish people in general thought of these things. And again, that's a weak argument for sure, but that's a lot of the poetic force we see. It's like when we talk about God showing up as a warrior in the whirlwind, and him thundering out of the storm made a similar point. a lot of the language of these sections of God's speech are evocative pictures that seem to be common ones to the Jewish poetic mind. God in the storm, God in the whirlwind, the Leviathan, and then Behemoth is one we know the least about. So that's always going to be a good point because we just don't, there's a lot of questions. But those are really good those are good questions to ask, right? Those are the right questions. Chase and then Rick.
Yeah, quick question. I was wondering if you viewed in Isaiah 27 when he says he struck down the heads of the lions and gave it out as food, if you viewed that one as well as poetic, or viewed that one maybe as that's a beast.
Yeah, I think to me it all falls in when Leviathan's talked about it's kind of the same idea where it's this representation of evil forces or it's a representation of Satan himself possibly or those have a lot of overlap themselves. In Isaiah 27 it seems like it's this huge serpent. It's connected to the twisted serpent and these ideas really bring the idea of Satan to mind to me. Again, another thing to think about is if the book of Job is organized chiastically, which means that it kind of reflects like a mirror in the middle, opens up like a book. In Job 28, this peculiar singular section in the middle about there's a mind for wisdom and all this, it's the center of the book. And if that's the case, then the beginning and the end of the book ought to mirror each other, all right? That's how a chiasm works. It's a Jewish poetic structure where it's like A and A prime. Chapter 1 and chapter 42 are A and A, but they're similar. If that's the case, then all this talk about Leviathan and Behemoth fall right in reflection with the conversation between God and Satan in heaven. That one's the weakest argument of all. That's why I didn't put it up there. It may not even be chiastic, right? We're searching for these things. Job says so many things without a clear answer that we have to kind of reason with it and wrestle with it. And that's why I thought it'd be worth doing this, is because this book is meant to be read this way to some extent, or else God would have told us, right? It's the glory of God to disclose matters, the glory of kings to search it out, right? What we're doing is, I think, what God intended, is to wrestle with this book and to see it means something for us. Good. Yeah, I won't say more about that. Roger? Oh, Rick, you're going to say something. Sorry.
When we get to poetic language, when we get to things we don't understand, we tend to focus on that and not what is meant to be focused. When God gives us a sign, for instance, Job knew what God was getting at when he mentioned those names. Mm-hmm. We know what that type of thing would instill in our own hearts. So we can see where the sign is pointing.
Yeah.
But if we spend all our time looking at the sign and not where it's pointing, we lose the entire message that God is trying to present. Yeah. And so when we do run across something like, well, I'm just not sure what he means by Behemoth, or I don't know what a prince of the power of the air, how that relates to Satan, or I don't know, any of the pictures in Revelation are. I know where the signs are pointing.
Yeah.
And then I can get the message and I can understand. I wanted Job to know something. Mm-hmm. And by the answer in 42, he got it.
Yeah. And I think it means we can too, right?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Ricky, and then Gene.
So I read it and like Roger was saying, okay, and as a person, a human, if I saw something like that, I had a problem with the flying monkeys and the Wizard of Oz. So why would I want to see the Behemoth or the Leviathan?
Sure.
Can't handle it. I can't do it, man.
Yeah.
Ain't no way.
Yeah.
No way.
I gotcha.
But God got this.
Yeah.
Thank God for that, because Rick would be no.
Toast. Yeah. Amen.
I don't want nothing with the Behemoth or the.
Yeah. That's the point.
That's the point.
Yeah.
But I do want God.
Yeah.
Because he got it covered.
Absolutely. Amen. Gene? No, go ahead. We'll get it in.
I just thought it was interesting. Job never really got his original question ever answered.
Yeah.
As to why.
Yeah.
Why is my family gone?
Yes.
But God says, basically, you don't need to know why specifically. You just need to know that I've got this. And so I think it's commendable that Job says, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
That's really a commentary on his faith.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great segue question for next week. There's some questions up here for chapter 42. We'll tackle those questions and do summary and conclusion next week. Thank you all for listening and for your good comments and questions. And I appreciate you bearing with me. So.